Imagine waking up one morning in the city of Jerusalem in the year 1187 and hearing a rumor spreading through the streets. At first it is only whispers, then it becomes panic. An entire army is coming, not a small raiding party, not a group of wandering soldiers, but a vast army led by one of the most powerful commanders of the medieval world, Saladin. Within days, the hills around Jerusalem begin to fill with tents, banners, horses, and thousands of soldiers. Fires burn across the landscape at night, like a second sky made of embers. Inside the city walls, the people realize something terrifying. Most of the kingdom's army is already gone, destroyed, and the city they live in, one of the most sacred places on earth, is about to face a siege. Before we step deeper into this story, take a quiet moment with me. If you enjoy slow, thoughtful journeys into history like this, you might consider supporting the channel with a like or a quick subscription. It helps these stories reach other curious minds around the world. And if you feel like it, tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Is it late evening, early morning, or maybe the middle of a quiet afternoon where you are? History has a strange way of connecting people across time and across continents. Now let us gently return to Jerusalem. To understand why the city suddenly found itself surrounded by danger, we have to look just a few months earlier to one of the most devastating battles of the Crusades. In the summer of the year 1187, the army of the Crusader kingdom marched out to confront Saladin near a place called the Horn of Hattin, a pair of volcanic hills overlooking the Sea of Galilee. It did not go well. The Crusader army, led by King Guy of Jerusalem, marched through dry land under intense heat. Saladin's forces surrounded them, cutting off access to water. Smoke from burning grass drifted across the battlefield, choking the soldiers and their horses. By the end of the battle, the Crusader army was essentially destroyed. Thousands were killed, many knights were captured, and perhaps most symbolically devastating of all, Saladin captured the true cross, the relic carried by Crusader armies that was believed to be a fragment of the cross of Jesus. For the Christian world, this was not just a military loss. It felt like a spiritual catastrophe. News of the disaster spread quickly across the region. Fortresses surrendered. Cities fell one by one. Within a few months, most of the Crusader kingdom had collapsed, which left only one truly important prize still standing: Jerusalem. But here is something many people do not realize. Jerusalem was never designed to face a siege alone. After the catastrophe at Hattin, the city was suddenly filled with refugees fleeing other towns that had already fallen to Saladin's army. Families arrived carrying what little they could save. Streets grew crowded. Supplies began to stretch thin. And worst of all, the city did not have enough soldiers. Most trained knights had died in the battle. So imagine the atmosphere inside the walls. Thousands of civilians, very few defenders, and an enormous army approaching. Yet somehow, in the middle of all that fear, one man stepped forward to organize the defense. A nobleman who had not planned to fight at all. His name was Balian of Ibelin, and the strange twist of fate that brought him into Jerusalem at this exact moment would soon shape the entire story of the siege. So let us step down from the city walls for a moment and walk into the streets of Jerusalem itself. Because when people imagine a siege, they often picture soldiers, weapons, and great stone walls being battered by giant machines. But the true story of a siege is usually quieter. It happens in kitchens, narrow alleyways, crowded churches, and dark rooms where families whisper late into the night. Inside Jerusalem, in the year 1187, life became a strange mix of waiting and worrying. The city was already full before the siege began. Refugees had been arriving for weeks from towns and castles that had fallen after the disaster at the Horn of Hattin. Some came from places only a few days away. Others had traveled across dangerous roads, bringing little more than the clothes they were wearing. Imagine the scene: carts piled with blankets and small bundles, children holding on to their parents, people asking the same question again and again. Is Jerusalem safe? At first, many believed the city's walls would protect them. Jerusalem had strong fortifications built and rebuilt over centuries. Thick stone towers guarded the gates. The walls stretched for several kilometers around the city. But walls alone do not win a siege. Food does, water does, and morale matters just as much as stone. Historical sources like the Chronicle of Ernul describe how the population inside the city suddenly grew far beyond what the normal supply system could support. Markets that once served a stable population now had to feed thousands of extra mouths. Bread became more precious, meat became rare. Even simple things like cooking oil and salt started to run low. Have you ever noticed how quickly people become anxious when the grocery store shelves look empty? Now imagine that feeling, but without trucks arriving tomorrow to restock them. In medieval sieges, hunger was often the most powerful weapon, and the defenders knew it. That is why people inside Jerusalem began organizing daily life carefully. Food had to be rationed. Water sources were guarded. Wells inside the city became gathering points where neighbors exchanged news rumors and sometimes fears. Rumors were everywhere. Some said Saladin's army was enormous. Others claimed reinforcements from Europe might arrive. And of course, no one really knew which stories were true. Meanwhile, the sound of the enemy army slowly became part of daily life. From the walls, people could see soldiers building camps across the surrounding hills. Tents stretched across the landscape like a temporary city of their own. At night, thousands of fires flickered in the darkness. Imagine standing on the wall and looking out at that sight. Would it feel like watching stars, or like being surrounded? Yet something remarkable also happened inside Jerusalem during these tense days. Instead of falling into chaos, many people began working together. Churches held constant prayers. Blacksmiths repaired weapons. Carpenters strengthened gates and towers. Even people with no military experience helped carry stones, water, and supplies to the defenders. The entire city slowly began transforming itself into something it had not expected to become, a fortress. But despite all this preparation, one hard truth remained. Jerusalem did not have enough trained soldiers to defend every tower and wall properly, and that problem would soon force Balian of Ibelin to make one of the most dramatic decisions of the entire siege. Faced with a city full of frightened civilians and far too few trained warriors, Balian of Ibelin understood something immediately. Jerusalem could not be defended in the usual way. Normally, a medieval city relied on experienced knights and professional soldiers to guard the towers, patrol the walls, and respond when attackers tried to break through. But after the disaster at the Horn of Hattin, most of those knights were gone, dead or prisoners in Saladin's camps. So Balian did something bold and honestly a little desperate. He began creating knights, not the traditional way with years of training and noble ceremonies in castles. Instead, Balian gathered ordinary men from the city, merchants, craftsmen, even young men who had never held a sword before. According to the medieval chronicle written by Ernul, Balian knighted dozens of these men in a single ceremony inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Imagine that moment. A blacksmith's apprentice kneels on the cold stone floor. A baker's son stands beside him. Maybe even a teenager who had never expected to see battle in his life. And suddenly, with the touch of a sword on the shoulder, they are knights, defenders of Jerusalem. Do you think that ceremony felt inspiring or terrifying? Probably both, but morale matters in a siege. Giving these men the title of knight was not only practical, it was psychological. It told the entire city that they were not helpless victims waiting for defeat. They were defenders. Meanwhile, outside the walls, Saladin's army was preparing the tools that made medieval sieges so frightening. Great wooden machines began appearing across the hills. Catapults, trebuchets, massive engines built to throw stones heavier than a person. Day after day, the machines hurled enormous rocks toward the city walls. When those stones struck, the sound echoed through the streets like thunder. Dust rose into the air. Towers trembled, and that was only the beginning. Saladin's engineers also began digging tunnels beneath the walls. This technique, called mining, was one of the most dangerous parts of siege warfare. By digging under the foundations and setting fires below the stone supports, Attackers could collapse entire sections of wall. Imagine standing on a tower, knowing that somewhere beneath your feet, enemy soldiers might be digging through the earth. It must have been a deeply unsettling thought. Still, the defenders held on. Citizens carried stones to repair damaged sections. Archers fired from the towers. The newly created knights tried to act brave even if their hands trembled when they held their swords. But Balian understood something the rest of the city slowly began to realize. Even courage has limits. Jerusalem's walls could not withstand constant attack forever. Supplies were shrinking. The population inside the city was far larger than its defenses were designed to support. And eventually, one moment made it clear that the end was approaching. A section of the wall was finally breached. The defenders managed to push the attackers back for a short time. But the message was clear. Jerusalem could fall by force, and that terrifying possibility forced Balian to consider a different path, one that might save the people inside the city, even if it meant surrender. At this point in the siege, the mood inside Jerusalem had quietly changed. The early days had been filled with determination. People believed the walls might hold. They believed reinforcements might appear on the horizon. But now the reality was becoming clear. Saladin's army was patient. The machines outside the walls continued to fire. Stones smashed against towers. Sections of the wall had already been damaged, and everyone inside the city understood a simple truth about medieval warfare. If an army storms the walls successfully, the city often pays a terrible price. The people of Jerusalem knew their own history well. 88 years earlier, when Crusader armies captured the city during the First Crusade in the year 1099, the result had been catastrophic. Contemporary chroniclers described widespread killing throughout the city. Stories of that event had traveled across generations. Now many feared history might repeat itself. This was the moment when Balian of Ibelin made perhaps the most important decision of the entire siege. Instead of waiting for the walls to collapse completely, he requested a meeting with Saladin. Now pause for a moment and imagine the scene. Two leaders meeting in the middle of a war, one defending a nearly helpless city, the other commanding one of the most powerful armies in the region. According to several historical sources, including the writings of Ibn al-Athir and later Christian chronicles, Balian spoke honestly during these negotiations. He warned Saladin that if Jerusalem were taken by force, the defenders might destroy the city's holy places and kill their own families, rather than allow them to fall into slavery. It was not an empty threat. In medieval sieges, desperate defenders sometimes did extreme things when they believed defeat was inevitable. Saladin now faced a choice. He could continue the assault and capture Jerusalem through violence, or he could negotiate a surrender. And surprisingly, he chose negotiation. Saladin offered terms that were unusual for many medieval sieges. Instead of allowing his army to storm the city, he allowed most inhabitants to leave peacefully if they paid a ransom. The ransom was set at 10 gold dinars for a man, 5 for a woman, and 1 for a child. Of course, not everyone inside Jerusalem could afford that. But even here, the story contains small moments of compassion. Historical records describe how some Muslim commanders and wealthy individuals paid the ransom for poorer families who could not afford their freedom. Even Saladin's own brother reportedly helped free groups of prisoners. It was not a perfect solution. Many people still lost their homes. Some were still enslaved. War always leaves scars. But compared to what could have happened during a violent sack of the city, the outcome was remarkably restrained. Soon the gates of Jerusalem would open. And what happened next? Thousands of people slowly leaving the city they loved would become one of the most emotional scenes of the entire siege. Soon after the agreement was reached, something unusual happened for a medieval siege. The gates of Jerusalem did not burst open in chaos. They opened slowly, and instead of soldiers rushing in with swords drawn, long lines of civilians began walking out. Imagine the scene on that quiet morning in the year 1187. Thousands of people gathering near the city gates. Families carrying small bundles of clothing tools, maybe a few coins hidden carefully in a pouch. Some people pushed carts filled with everything they could save from their homes. Others carried almost nothing at all. For many, Jerusalem had been their entire world. Now they were leaving it behind. According to historical accounts, the surrender agreement allowed many inhabitants to buy their freedom. As mentioned earlier, the ransom price was 10 gold dinars for a man, 5 for a woman, and 1 for a child. Wealthier families paid quickly and departed in organized groups. But what about the people who had no money? This is where the story takes a more human turn than many people expect from medieval warfare. Several Muslim chroniclers recorded that many of the poorest inhabitants were quietly helped. Wealthy officials, charitable groups, and even commanders within Saladin's army paid the ransom for thousands of people who could not afford it themselves. Saladin's brother Al-Adil is said to have personally requested permission to free a large number of prisoners. Even Balian of Ibelin, the same man who had defended the city, worked to negotiate freedom for many civilians who otherwise might have been enslaved. War had brought them to this moment, but mercy, at least in small ways, shaped how the story ended. Meanwhile, inside Jerusalem, another transformation was happening. For nearly 90 years, the city had been under Crusader rule. Now Muslim worship was returning to some of the most sacred places in the city. The Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which had been used for other purposes during the Crusader period, were carefully cleaned and prepared for prayer again. Chroniclers describe carpets being laid, water used to wash the sacred spaces, and prayers filling the air once more. For the Muslim world, this was a deeply symbolic victory. For Christian Europe, however, the news would soon cause shock and anger that would echo across the continent. Because when word finally reached Europe that Jerusalem had fallen, kings, knights, and ordinary believers reacted with alarm. How could the holy city have been lost? And what should be done to reclaim it? Those questions would soon spark a new and massive military effort known as the Third Crusade. It would bring famous figures like Richard the Lionheart into the story and launch another dramatic chapter in the struggle for the Holy Land. But before we step into that wider conflict, there is one final moment worth reflecting on inside the walls of Jerusalem. Because the siege of 1187 was not only a military event, it was also a deeply human story about fear, leadership, negotiation, and survival in a time when history itself seemed to hang in the balance. And so the story of the siege quietly reaches its final scene. By early October, in the year 1187, Jerusalem had changed hands without the kind of catastrophic destruction that many people inside the city had feared just weeks earlier. The gates were open, the armies had settled, and the long columns of departing civilians slowly faded into the surrounding hills. If you had stood on the walls of Jerusalem at that moment, you would have seen a strange mixture of emotions: relief, sadness, and perhaps a deep sense of exhaustion. War in the medieval world was rarely gentle. Cities that resisted too long were often destroyed. Chroniclers from both the Christian and Muslim worlds recorded countless sieges where the outcome ended in fire, massacre, and total ruin. But Jerusalem in 1187 followed a slightly different path. The Muslim historian Imad ad-Din al-Isfahani wrote that Saladin wished to avoid the kind of bloodshed that had followed the Crusader capture of Jerusalem in the year 1099. At that time, several medieval sources described streets filled with bodies after the Crusader assault. Saladin, by contrast, seemed determined to present himself not only as a conqueror, but also as a ruler of restraint. Of course, the story was not perfect. Many people still lost their homes. Thousands became refugees. Some who could not pay ransom were taken into slavery, which sadly was a common reality in medieval warfare. History is rarely simple, and victories often come with difficult human consequences. But even so, many historians today note that the relatively controlled surrender of Jerusalem in 1187 was remarkable for its time. And perhaps that is why the figures in this story remain so fascinating. Balian of Ibelin, the exhausted defender who negotiated instead of fighting to the bitter end, and Saladin, the ambitious commander who chose negotiation when total destruction might have been the easier path. Their decisions shaped the fate of tens of thousands of people inside those walls, and they remind us of something important about history. Sometimes the most powerful moments are not the battles themselves. Sometimes the most powerful moments happen when leaders decide to stop the fighting. But of course, history never truly pauses for long. When news of Jerusalem's fall finally reached Europe, the reaction was immediate and dramatic. Chroniclers described churches filled with worried believers, kings and nobles suddenly facing enormous pressure to respond. How could the holy city have been lost? And who would be brave enough to try to take it back? Within just a few years, the answer would arrive in the form of the Third Crusade, bringing some of the most famous names of the medieval world into the story. Leaders like Richard, the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and the aging but powerful Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa would soon march east. And once again, the lands around Jerusalem would become the stage for another enormous chapter of conflict. But that is a story for another time. For now, the siege of Jerusalem in 1187 leaves us with a quiet image, a city that had survived war, walls that had witnessed fear, courage, negotiation, and hope, and thousands of ordinary people who simply wanted to live another day. History often remembers kings and generals, yet behind every great event are countless families, merchants, children, and travelers whose lives are suddenly pulled into the currents of war. If you found this journey into the past meaningful, thank you for spending these moments exploring history together. Your curiosity keeps these stories alive. And if you enjoy thoughtful historical storytelling like this, stay with the channel, because many more fascinating journeys through the past are waiting just ahead. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to sharing the next story with you very soon.